Let yourself settle in now, finding that comfortable position where your body can simply rest. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose and let it out gently through your mouth. Feel the weight of your body sinking into whatever surface supports you, as if you're being gently embraced by gravity itself. Allow your shoulders to drop away from your ears, your jaw to soften and part slightly, and your eyes to close if they haven't already done so. Tonight, we're going to journey together through the stone corridors and candlelit chambers of medieval schools, where the scratch of quills on parchment and the murmur of Latin prayers created a world both harsh and sacred. Picture yourself standing in the doorway of an ancient scriptorium as the last light of day fades behind tall, narrow windows. The glass is thick and uneven, casting wavering patterns of amber light across worn stone floors. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax candles and old vellum, mixed with the faint smell of wood smoke from distant hearths. You can hear the distant chanting of monks echoing through stone hallways, their voices rising and falling in ancient melodies that seem to emerge from the very walls themselves. This is where we begin our exploration of what education was truly like in the Middle Ages, when learning was both privilege and punishment, when knowledge was precious and discipline was brutal. The stones beneath your feet are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, each one representing a student, a master, a scholar who walked these same paths in pursuit of learning. The walls around you have witnessed countless hours of study, prayer, and yes, suffering, as young minds were shaped through methods that would seem impossibly harsh to our modern sensibilities. Yet from these austere halls emerged some of the greatest thinkers of their age, men who would go on to shape the intellectual and spiritual landscape of medieval Europe. The very existence of schools in medieval Europe was not something to be taken for granted. In the chaos that followed the fall of Rome in the 5th century, much of the classical learning that had flourished for centuries nearly vanished entirely. The great libraries of Alexandria and Athens had been destroyed or abandoned, their precious scrolls scattered to the winds. The schools that had trained generations of Roman administrators, lawyers, and scholars crumbled along with the empire that had supported them. Roads fell into disrepair, trade networks collapsed, and the urban centers that had been the heart of classical civilization were largely abandoned. In this darkness, however, new lights began to flicker. The Christian Church, which had grown from a persecuted minority to the dominant religious force in Europe, recognized that its mission required educated clergy. The preservation of Christian texts, the copying of scriptures, and the conduct of church business all demanded literacy, and so the monasteries became the first guardians of learning in the medieval world. These were not schools as we might imagine them today, but rather communities of monks who understood that their religious mission required at least some of their number to be able to read and write. The earliest monastic schools were simple affairs, often consisting of little more than a corner of the monastery where an older monk would teach a handful of novices to read Latin and understand the basic principles of Christian doctrine. The students were typically oblates, young boys who had been dedicated to the monastic life by their parents, often as young as 7 years old. These children would spend their entire lives within the monastery walls, learning not only reading and writing, but also the complex liturgical practices that governed monastic life. The Rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century, provided the framework for monastic education throughout medieval Europe. Benedict understood that monks needed to be able to read the scriptures and participate fully in the divine office, the cycle of prayers that structured monastic life. His rules specified that certain hours of each day should be devoted to reading and study, making education an integral part of monastic life rather than an optional extra. The great Emperor Charlemagne, crowned on Christmas Day in the year 800, fundamentally transformed the educational landscape of medieval Europe. This towering figure, who stood nearly 7 feet tall and possessed an intellect to match his physical stature, understood that his vast empire needed educated administrators and clergy if it was to function properly. The Frankish kingdoms he had inherited were largely illiterate, with even many nobles unable to read or write. Charlemagne himself, despite his remarkable achievements, struggled with literacy throughout his life, though he was said to keep writing tablets under his pillow and practice forming letters late into the night. The reforms that Charlemagne instituted, known collectively as the Carolingian Renaissance, represented the first systematic approach to education since the fall of Rome. In 789, he issued the Admonitio Generalis, a comprehensive set of regulations that mandated the establishment of schools throughout his realm. Every monastery and cathedral was required to maintain a school, and these institutions were to be open not only to future monks and clergy, but also to the sons of the nobility and wealthy merchants who would serve in the imperial administration. The palace school at Aachen became the model for these new institutions. Here, under the direction of the English scholar Alcuin of York, the children of the nobility studied alongside future clergy, learning Latin grammar, rhetoric, and the basic principles of Christian doctrine. The curriculum was demanding and the standards were high, as Charlemagne understood that the future of his empire depended on having educated administrators who could read and write, keep records, and conduct the complex business of government. The Carolingian reforms also established standardized methods of copying manuscripts, ensuring that texts would be preserved accurately for future generations. The development of Carolingian minuscule, a clear and legible script that replaced the various local writing styles that had evolved during the Dark Ages, made it possible for scholars throughout Europe to read and understand texts that had been copied in distant monasteries. The medieval world came to recognize several distinct types of schools, each serving different purposes and social classes. The monastic schools, housed within the walls of abbeys and priories, remained primarily focused on training future monks. These institutions were often located in remote areas surrounded by forests and fields that provided both sustenance and isolation from the temptations of the secular world. The buildings themselves were designed to promote learning and contemplation, with scriptoriums positioned to catch the best light for reading and writing, and libraries carefully constructed to protect precious books from fire and theft. Students in monastic schools followed a routine that was both rigorous and spiritually demanding. They rose before dawn for the first prayers of the day, attended multiple services throughout the day, and spent long hours in study and contemplation. The curriculum was heavily weighted toward religious subjects, with students spending years memorizing the Psalms, learning the proper conduct of religious services, and studying the writings of the Church Fathers. Cathedral schools, attached to the great churches that dominated medieval cities, served a somewhat broader purpose. While they too focused on training clergy, they also provided education for the sons of noble families who might later serve in royal or ecclesiastical administration. These schools were often larger and more sophisticated than their monastic counterparts, with multiple masters teaching different subjects and a more diverse student body. The cathedral schools were typically located in the heart of medieval cities, surrounded by the bustling activity of urban life. Students could hear the sounds of markets and workshops outside their classroom windows, providing a constant reminder of the world they might one day help to govern. The curriculum at cathedral schools was more varied than at monastic institutions, with greater emphasis on practical subjects like letter writing, accounting, and the legal procedures that were essential for administrative work. Song schools represented a highly specialized form of education focused entirely on training choir boys. Music was considered one of the most important subjects in medieval education, not merely for its beauty, but because it was essential to the proper conduct of religious services. The elaborate polyphonic compositions that characterized medieval church music required skilled singers who could read musical notation, understand complex rhythms, and blend their voices harmoniously with others. Boys in song schools began their training at a very young age, often as young as 6 or 7 years old. They would spend their days learning to read both musical and textual notation, memorizing vast repertoires of chants and hymns, and perfecting their vocal techniques. The work was demanding, and the standards were extraordinarily high, as these young singers would eventually provide the musical foundation for the most important religious ceremonies of their time. The daily routine in song schools was structured around the liturgical calendar, with students learning different musical settings for various seasons and feast days. They would practice for hours each day, their young voices echoing through stone chapels, as they worked to master the intricate melodies that had been passed down through generations of church musicians. Grammar schools, which began to emerge in the later medieval period, represented something closer to what we might recognize as secular education. These schools, while still firmly rooted in Christian tradition, began to educate the sons of wealthy merchants and professionals who needed literacy for their trades but were not necessarily destined for religious life. The curriculum at grammar schools was more practical than at religious institutions, with greater emphasis on letter writing, basic arithmetic, and the vernacular languages that were becoming increasingly important in trade and commerce. It was from these grammar schools that the great universities of the medieval world would eventually emerge. As trade expanded and cities grew, there was an increasing demand for educated men who could serve in secular as well as religious capacities. The grammar schools provided the foundation for this new class of educated laymen, teaching them the basic skills they would need to succeed in an increasingly complex world. The question of who could attend these schools was determined almost entirely by birth and wealth. The medieval world was rigidly hierarchical, with society divided into 3 main groups: those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. Education was seen as the privilege of the first 2 groups, with the vast majority of the population, the workers, expected to learn what they needed through apprenticeship and oral tradition. Noble sons were expected to receive some form of education, though the nature and extent of this education varied considerably. The sons of great lords might be sent to cathedral schools or receive private tutoring from learned clerics. They would learn to read and write in Latin, understand the basic principles of Christian doctrine, and acquire the skills necessary for leadership in both secular and religious contexts. The sons of lesser nobles might receive a more limited education, perhaps learning only enough Latin to participate in religious services and handle basic administrative tasks. Some noble families preferred to educate their sons at home, hiring private tutors or sending them to the households of relatives or allies where they could receive both education and training in courtly behavior. Wealthy merchants and craftsmen increasingly sought education for their sons as well, recognizing that literacy and numeracy were becoming essential for success in trade. These families might send their sons to grammar schools or cathedral schools, paying fees that represented a significant investment in their children's future. The emergence of this merchant class as patrons of education represented a significant shift in medieval society, as wealth, rather than birth, began to determine access to learning. Occasionally, a peasant boy of exceptional ability might catch the attention of a local priest or lord and be sponsored for education. These cases were rare and remarkable, often becoming the subject of local legend. A village priest might notice a boy's quick mind and exceptional memory, recommending him to the local cathedral, school, or monastery. Sometimes a lord might sponsor the education of a peasant boy as an act of charity, or because he recognized the potential value of having an educated servant. The vast majority of medieval children, however, perhaps 90% or more, received no formal education at all. They learned what they needed to know through apprenticeship, observation, and the oral traditions of their communities. Peasant children learned farming techniques by working alongside their parents. Craft workers learned their trades through years of apprenticeship, and even nobles learned many essential skills through practical experience rather than formal instruction. The age at which boys entered school varied considerably, but most began their education between the ages of 7 and 14. 7 was considered the age of reason in medieval thought, when a child could begin to understand moral and intellectual concepts and be held responsible for their actions. This belief was rooted in both classical philosophy and Christian theology, which held that children younger than 7 were not capable of sin because they could not distinguish between right and wrong. Boys who entered monastic schools at age 7 were making a commitment that would shape their entire lives. They were expected to remain within the monastery until they took their final vows as monks or were dismissed for some reason. The process of becoming a monk was gradual, with boys spending years as oblates before becoming novices and eventually full brothers. During this time, they would receive not only academic education, but also training in the practical skills necessary for monastic life, including agriculture, craftsmanship, and the complex liturgical practices that governed monastic communities. Cathedral schools typically accepted boys at a somewhat older age, often between 10 and 14 years old. These students were expected to have already acquired basic literacy skills, either through preliminary education at home or in smaller local schools. The curriculum at cathedral schools was more advanced and specialized, requiring students to have a solid foundation in Latin grammar and basic Christian doctrine before they could begin their studies. The exclusion of girls from formal education was almost total throughout the medieval period. This exclusion was justified by deeply held beliefs about the nature and proper role of women in society. Medieval thinkers, influenced by classical philosophy and Christian theology, generally believed that women were intellectually inferior to men and that their proper sphere was domestic rather than scholarly. The few exceptions to this general exclusion were found primarily in convents, where daughters of noble families might receive some education as part of their religious training. Convents like those at Gandersheim, Quedlinburg, and Hildesheim maintained schools for the daughters of the nobility, but these institutions were rare and served only a tiny fraction of the female population. The education provided in convent schools was quite different from that offered to boys. Girls learned to read, primarily so they could participate in religious services and study devotional texts. They might also learn basic writing skills, though this was considered less important than reading. Much of their education focused on the feminine arts considered appropriate for women of their social class: embroidery, music, and the management of household affairs. Some noble women received education at home through private tutors, but this too was limited and focused primarily on religious and domestic subjects. A few exceptional women like Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century or Christine de Pizan in the 14th and 15th centuries managed to achieve remarkable learning despite these barriers. But they were extraordinary exceptions to the general rule. The systematic exclusion of women from education represented an enormous waste of human potential and reflected the deeply patriarchal nature of medieval society. This exclusion would persist well into the modern period, with most European universities remaining closed to women until the 19th century. A typical day in a medieval school began long before dawn, when the world was still wrapped in darkness and the air was sharp with cold. The bell tower would ring out the call to lauds, the first prayer service of the day, while the sky was still dark and stars were visible through the narrow windows. The sound of the bell would echo through stone corridors, rousing students from their sleep and calling them to begin another day of learning and devotion. Students would rise quickly from their hard straw mattresses, which provided little comfort against the cold stone floors. There was no time for leisurely awakening. The monastic schedule was rigorous and unforgiving, with every moment of the day carefully regulated. They would splash their faces with cold water from stone basins, the shock of the icy water helping to drive away the last vestiges of sleep. The washing facilities were primitive, consisting of little more than stone troughs filled with water that had often frozen solid during the coldest months of winter. The students' clothing was simple and practical, designed for durability rather than comfort. They wore rough woolen robes that scratched against their skin, simple leather shoes that provided little protection against the cold stone floors, and woolen stockings that were constantly damp from the moisture that seemed to permeate every medieval building. In winter, they might be allowed to wear additional layers, but warmth was considered a luxury that might soften the character of young scholars. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a meager affair that reflected the ascetic ideals of medieval education. Students would gather in the refectory, a large hall with long wooden tables and benches that had been worn smooth by generations of use. The meal typically consisted of thin porridge made from oats or barley, stale bread that was often moldy, and perhaps a cup of watered ale or thin beer. The food was simple, often unappetizing, and always insufficient for growing boys who spent their days in intense mental labor. The porridge was often flavored with nothing more than salt, and sometimes not even that. Fresh vegetables were rare, especially in winter, and meat was reserved for special occasions or feast days. Students learned to eat quickly and without complaint, as any expression of dissatisfaction with the food was considered a sin of pride and ingratitude. After these morning preparations, students would file into the school chamber, usually a large hall with high stone walls and narrow windows that provided little light even on the brightest days. The architecture of these spaces was designed to promote learning and contemplation, with high ceilings that lifted the mind toward heaven and stone walls that blocked out the distractions of the outside world. The air in the school chamber was often thick with smoke from poor-quality candles and the breath of many bodies pressed close together. Ventilation was poor, and the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and burning tallow could be overwhelming. In winter, the cold was bitter and unrelenting, as heating was considered a luxury that might soften the character of young scholars. Students would sit on hard wooden benches, their fingers often too cold to hold their writing implements properly. The furniture in medieval schools was simple and functional, designed for durability rather than comfort. Long wooden tables scarred by years of use served as writing surfaces. Students sat on backless benches that provided no support for long hours of study. The master's chair, usually the only comfortable seat in the room, was positioned at the front of the chamber where he could observe all of his students and maintain discipline. The lighting in medieval schools was always inadequate, creating a constant strain on young eyes. Windows were small and high, designed more for defense than illumination. On cloudy days or during the long winter months, students worked by the light of candles or oil lamps, which provided only a flickering and uncertain illumination. This poor lighting contributed to the high rate of eye problems among medieval scholars, many of whom suffered from severe vision problems by the time they reached middle age. The curriculum of medieval schools was dominated by the 7 liberal arts, a system of education inherited from classical antiquity but adapted to serve Christian purposes. This curriculum was based on the belief that certain subjects provided the foundation for all learning, and that mastery of these arts was essential for anyone who aspired to wisdom and understanding. The 7 liberal arts were divided into 2 groups: the trivium, which consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, which included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The trivium was considered the foundation of all education, providing the basic tools necessary for learning and communication. The quadrivium was more advanced and specialized, dealing with the mathematical and scientific subjects that were considered essential for a complete education. Grammar, the first art of the trivium, was not simply the study of correct speech and writing as we might understand it today. Rather, it was an intensive exploration of Latin language and literature that formed the foundation of all medieval learning. Students spent years memorizing vast passages of classical texts, learning to parse every word and understand every grammatical construction. The work was tedious and demanding, requiring precise attention to detail and perfect recall. The study of grammar began with the most basic elements of the Latin language, the sounds of letters, the formation of syllables, and the construction of words. Students learned to recite the alphabet, to recognize the different sounds that letters could make, and to understand how these sounds combined to form meaningful words. This foundational work was essential, as Latin was the language of learning throughout medieval Europe, and students who could not master its intricacies would be unable to progress in their studies. Once students had mastered the basics of Latin pronunciation and spelling, they moved on to the study of grammar proper. They learned the 8 parts of speech, the various forms that nouns and verbs could take, and the rules that governed the construction of sentences. This work was highly systematic and analytical, requiring students to understand not just what was correct, but why it was correct. The texts used for grammatical study were primarily classical Latin authors, particularly Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero. Students would spend months or even years working through these texts, parsing every sentence and analyzing every grammatical construction. They were expected to memorize large portions of these works, as the ability to quote classical authors was considered a mark of education and refinement. The study of grammar also included what we might today call literary analysis. Students learned to understand the meaning of texts, to recognize different literary devices, and to appreciate the beauty and elegance of classical Latin prose and poetry. This work was considered essential for developing the refined sensibilities that were expected of educated men. Rhetoric, the second art of the trivium, taught students how to speak persuasively and write eloquently. This subject was considered essential training for future clergy who would need to deliver sermons and engage in theological debates. Students learned to construct arguments, recognize logical fallacies, and present their ideas in the most compelling possible manner. The study of rhetoric was based primarily on classical texts, particularly Cicero's works on oratory and Quintilian's comprehensive treatise on the education of orators. Students learned the 5 parts of rhetoric: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. Each of these elements was studied in great detail, with the students practicing endlessly to perfect their skills. Invention involved learning how to discover and develop arguments on any given topic. Students practiced with set themes and learned to argue both sides of controversial questions. They studied the various types of arguments, the different kinds of evidence that could be used to support a position, and the methods for refuting opposing arguments. Arrangement dealt with the organization of speeches and written works. Students learned how to structure their arguments for maximum effect, how to order their evidence to build a compelling case, and how to craft introductions and conclusions that would capture and hold their audience's attention. Style involved learning to express ideas clearly and elegantly. Students studied the different levels of style appropriate for different occasions and audiences, learned to use various figures of speech and rhetorical devices, and practiced crafting sentences that were both grammatically correct and aesthetically pleasing. Memory was considered one of the most important aspects of rhetoric, as medieval education placed enormous emphasis on the ability to recall vast amounts of information. Students learned various mnemonic techniques, practiced memorizing long passages of text, and developed the ability to deliver speeches without notes. Delivery dealt with the physical aspects of speaking, voice, gesture, and movement. Students learned to control their breathing, to project their voices clearly, and to use appropriate gestures to emphasize their points. They practiced in front of their classmates and masters, receiving detailed feedback on every aspect of their performance. Logic, the third art of the trivium, was perhaps the most challenging and intellectually demanding of all the subjects in the medieval curriculum. Students learned to reason systematically, to identify valid and invalid arguments, and to construct proofs for complex propositions. This training was considered essential for theological study, as it provided the tools necessary to understand and defend Christian doctrine against heretical challenges. The study of logic was based primarily on the works of Aristotle, particularly his treatises on logic known collectively as the Organon. Students learned about syllogisms, the fundamental form of logical reasoning, and practiced constructing and analyzing these formal arguments. They studied the different types of propositions, the various ways in which arguments could be valid or invalid, and the methods for detecting logical fallacies. The work was highly abstract and demanding, requiring students to think in ways that were often quite different from their everyday experience. They learned to distinguish between the form and content of arguments, to recognize when reasoning was sound regardless of whether they agreed with the conclusions, and to construct their own logical proofs for complex philosophical and theological questions. Students in logic classes engaged in formal debates called disputations, where they would argue complex philosophical questions using the rigorous methods they had learned. These debates were highly structured affairs, with specific rules governing how arguments could be presented and challenged. Students learned to defend positions they might not personally believe, developing their ability to think critically and argue persuasively regardless of their personal convictions. The four arts of the quadrivium represented the mathematical and scientific portion of the medieval curriculum. These subjects were taught in a highly theoretical manner, with little emphasis on practical application. Students learned to work with numbers and geometric figures, but they were more likely to contemplate the mystical properties of mathematical relationships than to use mathematics to solve real-world problems. Arithmetic, the first art of the quadrivium, involved the study of numbers and their properties. Students learned to perform basic mathematical operations, but much of their study focused on the philosophical and theological significance of numbers. They studied the properties of perfect numbers, the mystical significance of certain numerical relationships, and the ways in which mathematical principles reflected divine order. The study of arithmetic was based primarily on the works of ancient mathematicians like Euclid and Boethius. Students learned to work with Roman numerals, which were cumbersome and difficult to use for complex calculations. They studied the properties of odd and even numbers, the relationships between different types of numbers, and the ways in which numerical patterns reflected underlying mathematical truths. Much of the work in arithmetic was theoretical rather than practical. Students spent more time contemplating the philosophical implications of mathematical relationships than learning to solve practical problems. They studied the significance of the number 7, which appeared frequently in Scripture and was considered to have special mystical properties. They learned about the tetractys, a triangular arrangement of 10 dots that was considered to represent the fundamental harmony of the universe. Geometry, the second art of the quadrivium, dealt with the properties of shapes and spatial relationships. Students learned about points, lines, angles, and various geometric figures. But again, much of their study was theoretical rather than practical. They studied the works of Euclid and learned to construct geometric proofs. But they were unlikely to use these skills for practical purposes like surveying or construction. The study of geometry was considered important not only for its mathematical content, but also for its philosophical and theological implications. Students learned to see geometric relationships as reflections of divine order and to appreciate the beauty and elegance of mathematical truth. They studied the properties of the circle, which was considered to be the most perfect of all geometric figures, and learned about the mathematical relationships that governed the construction of regular polygons. Music, the third art of the quadrivium, was treated as a mathematical science rather than a practical art. Students learned about the numerical ratios that govern harmony and rhythm, studying the mathematical relationships that made certain combinations of sounds pleasing to the ear. They learned about the music of the spheres, the belief that the movements of the heavenly bodies created a cosmic harmony that was reflected in earthly music. The study of music was based primarily on the works of ancient theorists like Pythagoras and Boethius. Students learned about the mathematical ratios that governed musical intervals, the relationships between different modes and scales, and the ways in which musical harmony reflected the fundamental order of the universe. They studied the three types of music recognized by medieval theorists: musica mundana, the music of the spheres; musica humana, the harmony of the human body and soul; and musica instrumentalis, the music actually performed by singers and instrumentalists. While students learned the theoretical foundations of music, they also received practical training in singing and sometimes in playing instruments. All students were expected to be able to participate in religious services which require the ability to sing plain chant and understand basic musical notation. Some students received more advanced musical training, learning to sing complex polyphonic compositions and to play instruments like the organ or various string instruments. Astronomy, the fourth art of the quadrivium, dealt with the movements of the heavenly bodies and their influence on earthly affairs. Students learned about the structure of the universe, the movements of the planets, and the ways in which celestial events could be predicted and interpreted. Much of their study was closely connected to astrology, which was considered a legitimate science in the medieval period. The study of astronomy was based on the works of ancient astronomers like Ptolemy and more recent Islamic scholars whose works had been translated into Latin. Students learned about the geocentric model of the universe, with the Earth at the center, surrounded by the celestial spheres carrying the sun, moon, and planets. They studied the movements of these bodies, learned to predict eclipses and other celestial events, and understood how the positions of the planets were thought to influence human affairs. Students learned to use various astronomical instruments, including the astrolabe, which was used to measure the positions of stars and planets. They studied the calendar and learned to calculate the dates of religious festivals, which was considered an important practical skill. They also learned about the zodiac and the ways in which astrological influences were thought to affect human personality and behavior. For older students who showed particular promise and were destined for advanced religious careers, the curriculum expanded to include canon law and theology. Canon law governed the internal affairs of the church and required precise knowledge of countless rules and precedents that had been developed over centuries of church history. Students learned about the authority of different types of church law, the proper procedures for ecclesiastical courts, and the various penalties that could be imposed for different types of religious offenses. The study of canon law was highly practical, as graduates would need to use this knowledge in their careers as priests, bishops, and church administrators. Students learned about marriage law, which governed one of the most important aspects of medieval life, and about the various types of ecclesiastical crimes and their punishments. They studied the relationship between church and secular law and learned how to navigate the complex legal landscape of medieval Europe. Theology, the queen of the medieval sciences, represented the culmination of medieval education. Students who progressed to this level had already mastered the 7 liberal arts and demonstrated exceptional ability and dedication. The study of theology demanded years of intensive work and a deep understanding of Scripture, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the complex philosophical arguments that had been developed over centuries of Christian thought. The curriculum in theology was built around the study of Scripture, which was considered the ultimate source of divine truth. Students learned to read and interpret the Bible using the 4 levels of meaning recognized by medieval scholars: the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical. They studied the works of the Church Fathers, particularly Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great, whose writings provided the foundation for medieval Christian thought. Students also engaged with the philosophical questions that were central to medieval theology. They studied the relationship between faith and reason, the nature of God, the problem of evil, and the various proofs for the existence of God. They learned to use the tools of logic and rhetoric to defend Christian doctrine against various challenges and to construct sophisticated theological arguments. The study of theology involved intensive reading, memorization, and debate. Students were expected to memorize vast portions of Scripture and to be able to quote relevant passages to support their arguments. They participated in formal disputations where they would defend complex theological positions against challenging questions from their peers and masters. The teaching methods employed in medieval schools were unlike anything used in modern education. The scarcity of books and the emphasis on memorization created a learning environment that was both intensely oral and highly repetitive. Students learned primarily through listening, memorizing, and reciting, with little emphasis on independent investigation or critical thinking as we understand it today. The primary method of instruction was called lectio, which involved the master reading aloud from a text while students listened and attempted to memorize what they heard. Books were precious and rare, often costing more than a laborer's yearly wages, so most students never held a complete text in their hands. Instead, they relied on their memory to retain the vast amounts of information they were expected to learn. The process of lectio was slow and methodical. The master would read a passage from a text, often repeating it several times to ensure that students had heard it correctly. He would then explain the meaning of the passage, parsing difficult words and phrases, and placing the text in its proper context. Students were expected to listen carefully and to ask questions about anything they did not understand. After the master had explained a text, students would be required to recite it back to him, demonstrating that they had not only heard the words, but also understood their meaning. This process of repetition and recitation was considered essential for true learning, as medieval educators believed that knowledge had to be internalized through constant repetition before it could be truly possessed. Disputatio, or formal debate, was another crucial element of medieval education. Students were required to argue both sides of complex questions, developing their ability to think critically and express themselves clearly. These debates were highly structured affairs, with specific rules governing how arguments could be presented and challenged. The topics for disputations were usually drawn from the texts that students had been studying. A master might pose a question about the interpretation of a particular passage from Scripture or ask students to defend a particular philosophical position. Students would then be required to construct formal arguments using the tools of logic and rhetoric they had learned to support their positions. These debates could become quite heated, with students passionately defending positions they might not personally believe but were required to argue for the sake of their education. The ability to argue both sides of a question was considered essential for developing true understanding, as students needed to be able to anticipate and respond to objections to their own positions. The master would oversee these debates, correcting students when they made logical errors or failed to follow the proper forms of argument. He would also pose challenging questions designed to test the students' understanding and to push them to think more deeply about the issues at hand. Dictation was perhaps the most tedious aspect of medieval schooling. Students spent hours copying texts as masters read them aloud, laboriously forming each letter with their quills and trying to keep up with the pace of dictation. This process was necessary because of the scarcity of books, as students needed to create their own copies of the texts they were studying. The work of dictation was slow and painstaking, requiring perfect attention to detail and exceptional patience. Students had to listen carefully to the master's reading, understand what was being said, and then reproduce it accurately on their writing materials. A single mistake could ruin hours of work, as there was no easy way to correct errors once they had been made. The physical act of writing was itself challenging. Students used quills made from bird feathers, which had to be carefully prepared and maintained. The quills were cut to a point and split to hold ink, but they wore out quickly and had to be constantly trimmed and adjusted. The ink was made from various materials, including oak galls, iron, and carbon, and it often had a tendency to fade or smudge. Students wrote on various materials depending on what was available and what they could afford. The most common writing surface was parchment, made from animal skins that had been specially prepared for writing. Parchment was expensive and had to be used carefully, as mistakes could not easily be corrected. For practice work, students often used wax tablets, which could be smoothed and reused many times. The process of dictation was made even more difficult by the fact that medieval Latin texts were often written in a continuous script, without spaces between words or punctuation marks. Students had to learn to recognize where words began and ended, and to understand the grammatical structure of sentences without the visual cues that modern readers take for granted. Rote memorization was emphasized above all other learning methods in medieval schools. Students were expected to memorize vast quantities of text, often chanting passages in unison to the rhythm of a wooden clapper. The sound of dozens of voices reciting Latin grammar rules or scripture passages would echo through the stone halls of medieval schools, creating a constant background hum of scholarly activity. The emphasis on memorization was based on the belief that true learning required complete internalization of knowledge. Students were expected to know their texts so thoroughly that they could recite them perfectly from memory, without hesitation or error. This level of memorization was considered essential for advanced study, as students needed to be able to recall relevant passages instantly during debates or discussions. The methods used to aid memorization were sophisticated and varied. Students learned various mnemonic techniques, including the use of visual imagery, rhythmic patterns, and association with familiar objects or places. They practiced reciting texts while walking, as physical movement was believed to aid memory. They also used musical settings for texts, as melody was considered one of the most powerful aids to memorization. The process of memorization was gradual and systematic. Students would begin by learning short passages, gradually building up to longer and more complex text. They would recite the same passages over and over, day after day, until they could reproduce them perfectly, without conscious effort. The goal was to internalize the texts so completely that they became part of the student's mental furniture, available for instant recall whenever needed. The tools and materials used in medieval schools were simple but precious, reflecting both the technological limitations of the age and the high value placed on learning. Students wrote primarily on wax tablets with metal styluses, scratching their letters into the soft wax surface. These tablets were made from wooden frames with a layer of beeswax spread evenly across the surface. The wax could be smoothed and reused countless times, making these tablets economical for practice work and daily exercises. The stylus, usually made of bone, metal, or hardwood, had two ends, one pointed for writing and one flat for smoothing the wax when corrections needed to be made. Students learned to hold the stylus properly, to control the pressure of their writing, and to form their letters with precision and consistency. The process of writing on wax was quite different from writing on paper, requiring a steady hand and careful attention to avoid scratching too deeply into the tablet. For more formal writing, students used reed quills cut from goose or swan feathers. The preparation of these quills was an art in itself, requiring careful selection of the proper feathers, precise cutting to create the writing point, and regular maintenance to keep the quills in good working condition. The best quills came from the wing feathers of large birds, as these were strong enough to withstand the pressure of writing while flexible enough to create smooth, flowing lines. The process of preparing a quill began with selecting a suitable feather, usually one that had been allowed to harden for several months after being plucked from the bird. The feather was then heated and shaped to create the proper curve, and the tip was cut at an angle to form the writing point. A small slit was cut in the tip to help the quill hold ink, and the sides were carefully trimmed to ensure smooth writing. Ink was made from various materials, with the most common recipe involving oak galls, iron sulfate, and gum arabic mixed with water or wine. Oak galls were round growths that formed on oak trees in response to wasp stings, and they contained high levels of tannic acid that was essential for making permanent ink. The iron sulfate reacted with the tannic acid to create a dark, long-lasting color that would not fade over time. The process of making ink was complex and time-consuming. The oak galls had to be crushed and soaked in water or wine for several days to extract the tannic acid. Iron sulfate was then added to create the chemical reaction that produced the dark color. Gum arabic, made from the sap of acacia trees, was added to give the ink the proper consistency and to help it adhere to the writing surface. Students learned to mix their own ink and to judge the proper consistency for different types of writing. Ink that was too thick would clog the quill and create uneven lines, while ink that was too thin would spread and blur on the writing surface. The color of the ink also varied depending on the proportions of ingredients used, ranging from deep black to various shades of brown. Vellum, made from specially prepared animal skins, was the primary writing material for important documents and finished works. The creation of vellum was a complex and labor-intensive process that required considerable skill and expertise. The skins of calves, sheep, or goats were first soaked in lime water to remove hair and flesh, then stretched on frames and scraped with special knives to create a smooth, even surface. The quality of vellum varied considerably depending on the age and type of animal used, the skill of the craftsman who prepared it, and the care taken in the preparation process. The finest vellum, made from the skins of young calves, was incredibly smooth and white, providing an ideal surface for the most important texts. Lesser grades of vellum, made from older animals or prepared less carefully, were used for everyday work and practice exercises. The cost of vellum was enormous by medieval standards. A single sheet of high-quality vellum might cost as much as a laborer's daily wages, making it far too expensive for routine student use. Most student work was done on cheaper materials like parchment made from sheep or goat skins, or on the reusable wax tablets that could serve for countless exercises. The creation of illuminated manuscripts was considered one of the highest forms of medieval art. Students who showed artistic talent might be taught to create the elaborate decorated initials and margin illustrations that adorned the finest medieval books. This work required not only artistic skill, but also knowledge of the symbolic meanings of different colors and designs, as well as the theological significance of various decorative motifs. The process of illumination began with the preparation of the page, which had to be carefully planned to accommodate both text and decoration. The scribe would first copy the text, leaving spaces for the illuminated initials and decorations. The illuminator would then add the decorative elements, using brushes made from animal hair and pigments made from various minerals, plants, and even insects. Gold leaf was often used for the most important decorations, applied over a base of gesso or glue to create a brilliant reflective surface. The application of gold leaf required considerable skill, as the material was extremely thin and fragile. It had to be applied in calm conditions, as even a slight breeze could cause the delicate sheets to wrinkle or tear. The pigments used in illuminated manuscripts were expensive and often difficult to obtain. Ultramarine blue, made from lapis lazuli imported from distant lands, was worth more than its weight in gold. Vermilion red, made from cinnabar, was equally precious. Other colors were made from more common materials: yellow from saffron or certain plant dyes, green from copper compounds, and purple from various shellfish or plant sources. Students learning the art of illumination practiced first on scraps of parchment or vellum, gradually working up to more complex designs. They learned to mix pigments to achieve the desired colors, to apply paint evenly and smoothly, and to create the intricate patterns and designs that characterized medieval illumination. The work required steady hands, perfect eyesight, and infinite patience, as a single mistake could ruin hours or even days of work. Books were so valuable in the medieval period that they were often chained to lecterns in school libraries, preventing theft and ensuring that these precious resources remained available to future generations of students. The chains were usually attached to the back cover of the book and long enough to allow the book to be opened and read while still secured to the lectern. These chained libraries were marvels of medieval organization and security. The books were arranged on slanted lecterns that allowed for easy reading while keeping the volume secure. The chains were designed to allow the books to be opened fully while preventing them from being removed from the library. Some libraries had dozens or even hundreds of chained books, representing an enormous investment in learning and scholarship. The process of consulting a book in a chained library required patience and planning. Students had to request permission to use specific texts, and they were often supervised while reading to ensure that the books were not damaged. The lighting in these libraries was usually poor, making reading difficult and tiring. Students learned to work quickly and efficiently, taking notes on their wax tablets or memorizing important passages for later study. The discipline in medieval schools was harsh, beyond anything that would be acceptable in modern educational settings. Physical punishment was not only accepted, but considered essential for proper education. The theological justification for this brutality was that physical correction was necessary to drive out the sin and laziness that were considered natural to fallen humanity. Medieval educators believed firmly in the biblical principle that sparing the rod would spoil the child, and they applied this principle with ruthless consistency. The birch rod was the primary tool of correction in medieval schools. These rods were made from bundles of birch twigs bound together with cord or leather straps. The birch was preferred because it was flexible enough to sting without causing permanent injury, yet strong enough to deliver memorable punishment. Fresh rods were prepared regularly, as the twigs would break and wear out with use. Students were beaten for a wide variety of offenses that would be considered trivial by modern standards. Making mistakes in recitation, failing to memorize assigned passages, speaking out of turn, moving without permission, or showing any sign of inattention could all result in immediate physical punishment. The beatings were administered without warning and without regard for the student's age or previous record. The ferula, a flat piece of wood or leather paddle, was used to strike students' hands and arms. This implement was designed to cause sharp, stinging pain without permanent injury. Students would be required to extend their hands palm up while the master delivered the prescribed number of blows. The pain was intense and immediate, and the marks would often remain visible for days afterward. Some schools designated specific days of the week for collective punishment, earning the name Ferule Friday among students who dreaded these weekly sessions of correction. On these days, any student who had committed infractions during the week would receive punishment, regardless of the severity of their offenses. The practice was intended to maintain discipline and remind students of the consequences of misbehavior. More serious offenses might result in a student being stretched across a specially designed whipping bench, where they could be beaten with greater force and precision. These benches were designed to hold the student securely while exposing their back and legs to punishment. The beatings administered on these benches were severe and often left students unable to sit comfortably for days or weeks afterward. The masters who administered these punishments were often men who had themselves endured similar treatment as students. They viewed physical correction as an essential part of education, necessary for developing character and instilling proper respect for authority. Many genuinely believed that they were helping their students by beating them, as the pain was thought to drive out sinful impulses and encourage proper behavior. The constant threat of physical punishment created an atmosphere of fear and tension in medieval schools that is difficult for modern minds to comprehend. Students learned to be silent and obedient, to follow rules without question, and to accept correction without complaint. Any sign of rebellion or independent thinking was swiftly and brutally suppressed. The psychological effects of this harsh discipline were profound and lasting. Students learned to associate learning with pain and fear, and many developed a lifelong aversion to intellectual pursuits. Others became so focused on avoiding punishment that they lost the natural curiosity and joy in learning that should characterize education. The system produced students who were obedient and compliant, but often lacking in creativity and independent thought. Despite the harsh discipline that dominated most aspects of medieval school life, students did have brief periods of recreation and rest that provided temporary relief from the constant pressure of study and the threat of punishment. These moments were precious and rare, offering glimpses of the childhood that was largely suppressed by the demands of medieval education. During short breaks between classes or prayer services, students might be allowed to walk in the cloister garden or courtyard adjacent to the school buildings. These spaces were usually simple affairs, with perhaps a well or fountain in the center and covered walkways around the perimeter. The gardens were designed primarily for contemplation rather than recreation, but they provided a welcome change from the confines of the classroom. Students would walk quietly in these spaces, often in silence, as talking was frequently forbidden even during breaks. They might engage in simple games with whatever materials were available, such as kicking around a pig's bladder that had been inflated to serve as a ball. These games were rough and simple, with few rules and little organization, but they provided essential physical activity for boys who spent most of their day sitting on hard benches. Other forms of recreation included simple contests of skill or knowledge, such as reciting poetry or solving riddles. These activities were often educational in nature, as masters believed that even recreation should serve a pedagogical purpose. Students might compete to see who could recite the longest passage from memory or who could solve mathematical problems most quickly. The seasonal cycle provided some variation in recreational activities. In winter, students might be allowed to slide on ice or build snow figures during their brief breaks. In spring and summer, they might gather flowers or herbs for use in the school's infirmary or kitchen. These activities were always closely supervised and could be curtailed immediately if students became too boisterous or excited. Meals provided another form of respite from the rigors of academic life, though even these were strictly regulated and often unpleasant. The midday meal was usually the most substantial of the day, typically consisting of bread, ale, or weak beer, and some form of protein such as beans, eggs, or occasionally meat. The bread served in medieval schools was usually coarse and dark, made from a mixture of grains that might include wheat, rye, barley, or oats, depending on what was available and affordable. The bread was often stale by the time it was served, as fresh bread was considered a luxury. Students learned to soften hard bread by dipping it in their ale or whatever liquid was available. Ale, or weak beer, was the standard drink at medieval schools, as water was often unsafe to drink. The ale served to students was usually of poor quality, thin and weak compared to what adults might drink. It provided some nutrition and calories, but was hardly enjoyable. In some schools, students might receive milk or watered wine on special occasions, but these were rare treats. The protein portion of the meal was usually minimal and often unappetizing. Beans were a common staple, providing necessary protein at low cost. Eggs might be served occasionally, usually in some form of simple preparation that made them stretch to feed many students. Meat was reserved for feast days and special occasions, and when it was served, it was usually of poor quality and prepared simply. Vegetables, when available, were usually root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, or onions that could be stored through the winter. Fresh vegetables were rare, especially during the long winter months when preserved foods made up the bulk of the diet. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables contributed to various nutritional deficiencies that were common among medieval students. Even during meals, the atmosphere remained strictly controlled and educational. Students were expected to eat in silence, communicating only through hand gestures when absolutely necessary. This rule was enforced as strictly as any other aspect of school discipline, with violations resulting in immediate punishment. The silence was intended to promote reflection and prevent the meal from becoming a social occasion that might distract from the serious business of education. Some schools designated one student to read aloud during meals, usually from Scripture or the lives of saints. This practice served the dual purpose of providing edification while preventing conversation. Students learned to eat quickly and efficiently while listening to the reading, developing the ability to concentrate on intellectual content even while engaged in physical activities. The emergence of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries represented a revolutionary development in medieval education that would fundamentally transform the intellectual landscape of Europe. These institutions began as informal gatherings of masters and students who came together to pursue advanced study in specialized subjects like law, medicine, and theology. But they quickly evolved into formal organizations with their own rules, customs, and privileges. The University of Bologna, established in the late 11th century, became the first true university in Europe and the model for legal education throughout the continent. Bologna's focus on Roman law attracted students from across Europe who came to study the complex legal codes that were becoming increasingly important in medieval society. The university was organized as a guild of students who hired their own masters and controlled many aspects of their education. The University of Paris, founded in the early 12th century around the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, became the intellectual center of Europe and the model for theological education. Paris attracted the greatest minds of the medieval world, including scholars like Peter Abelard, Thomas Aquinas, and Duns Scotus, who developed the sophisticated philosophical and theological systems that would dominate European thought for centuries. Oxford University, established in the late 12th century, combined elements of both the Bologna and Paris models to create a uniquely English approach to higher education. Oxford's collegiate system, with students living and studying in separate colleges under the supervision of masters, became the model for universities throughout the English-speaking world. Universities were organized as self-governing corporations or guilds, with both masters and students having formal roles in governance. This system was modeled on the craft guilds that governed trade and manufacturing in medieval cities, but adapted to the special needs of academic communities. The universities had their own laws, courts, and privileges that set them apart from the secular authorities of the cities where they were located. Students at medieval universities were grouped into nations based on their geographical origins, and these nations often competed fiercely with one another in both academic and social contexts. The English nation might compete with the French nation, or students from northern regions might rivalry with those from the south. These divisions sometimes led to serious conflicts that required intervention by university authorities or even local magistrates. The rental of halls and the provision of lodging became major concerns as universities grew in size and importance. Most students lived in rented rooms or halls that were often overcrowded, poorly maintained, and expensive. The competition for decent accommodations was fierce, and many students lived in conditions that were barely adequate for survival, let alone study. University life was notorious for its rowdiness and disorder, a stark contrast to the strict discipline that characterized earlier forms of medieval education. Students, many of whom were young men from wealthy families with considerable time and money at their disposal, often engaged in drinking, fighting, gambling, and other forms of misconduct that brought them into frequent conflict with local authorities and townspeople. The tension between town and gown became one of the most persistent features of medieval university life. Students often considered themselves above local laws and customs, protected by the special privileges that universities had negotiated with secular and ecclesiastical authorities. This attitude led to frequent clashes with townspeople who resented the students' arrogance and the disruption they caused to local life. Student riots were common occurrences in medieval university towns. These might begin as disputes over the price of food or lodging, conflicts between different nations of students, or disagreements with university authorities over academic policies. Once started, these riots could quickly escalate into serious disturbances that required military intervention to restore order. The academic year at medieval universities was structured around the church calendar, with major breaks during important religious seasons. Students would typically arrive in the fall and remain through the spring, though some continued their studies year-round. The curriculum was highly structured, with students required to master certain subjects before being allowed to proceed to more advanced studies. The question of women's education in the medieval period reveals the profound gender inequalities that characterized medieval society and that would persist well into the modern era. While the exclusion of women from formal education was nearly total, there were a few exceptional circumstances where women could receive some form of learning, though always within carefully circumscribed limits that reflected contemporary beliefs about female capabilities and proper roles. Some convents, particularly those that served the daughters of noble families, did maintain schools that provided education for their residents. The convent at Gandersheim in Germany, for example, became famous for the plays written by the canoness Hroswitha in the 10th century. The abbey at Quedlinburg was another center of female learning, where noble women could receive education in reading, writing, and religious studies. The education provided in these convent schools was quite different from that offered to male students. The curriculum was heavily weighted toward religious subjects, with students spending most of their time studying Scripture, the lives of saints, and devotional literature. They learned to read primarily so they could participate in religious services and engage in private prayer and meditation. Writing skills were considered less important for women than reading, as women were not expected to engage in the kinds of administrative or scholarly activities that required extensive writing. When women did learn to write, it was usually for the purpose of copying religious texts or composing personal devotional works rather than for any public or professional purpose. Much of the education provided to women focused on what were considered the appropriate feminine arts: embroidery, weaving, music, and the management of household affairs. These skills were considered essential for women of noble birth who would be expected to manage large households and supervise numerous servants. The needlework produced in medieval convents was often of extraordinary quality, representing not only artistic achievement, but also a form of religious devotion. Some noble women received education at home through private tutors, though this was relatively rare and usually limited in scope. These women might learn to read in both Latin and the vernacular languages, to understand basic arithmetic for household management, and to appreciate music and poetry. A few exceptional women like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile became highly educated and used their learning to influence political and cultural affairs. The systematic exclusion of women from universities and higher education represented an enormous waste of human potential that reflected the deeply patriarchal nature of medieval society. The few women who did achieve significant learning, like Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, or Julian of Norwich, were remarkable exceptions who had to overcome enormous social and institutional barriers to pursue their intellectual interests. The arguments used to justify women's exclusion from education were based on both classical philosophy and Christian theology. Medieval thinkers following Aristotle believed that women were naturally inferior to men in their reasoning capacity, and that education might actually be harmful to them by encouraging pride and rebellion against male authority. Christian theologians argued that women's primary role was domestic, and that excessive learning might interfere with their duties as wives and mothers. This exclusion would persist well into the modern period, with most European universities remaining closed to women until the 19th century. Even when women were eventually admitted to higher education, they often faced significant discrimination and were barred from many professions that required university training. The financial aspects of medieval education created significant barriers that limited access to learning for all but the wealthiest members of society. The costs associated with education were substantial and multifaceted, including not only tuition fees, but also expenses for books, writing materials, lodging, food, and clothing that could easily exceed the annual income of most medieval families. Tuition fees could be paid in various forms depending on local customs and the resources available to students' families. Cash payments were preferred by most schools, but many families lacked sufficient liquid assets to pay fees in coin. Instead, they might pay in kind with agricultural products like grain, wine, or livestock. Some schools accepted payments of goods like cloth, metalwork, or other valuable items that could be used or sold to meet the institution's needs. The cost of books represented one of the most significant expenses associated with medieval education. A single book might cost as much as a skilled craftsman's annual salary, making it impossible for most students to own more than a few essential texts. Students often shared books, taking turns to copy important passages or memorize key sections. Some enterprising students supported themselves by copying texts for wealthier classmates or by renting out their own books to other students. Writing materials were another significant expense that added to the overall cost of education. Parchment and vellum were expensive and had to be used carefully, as mistakes could not be easily corrected. Quills required regular replacement and maintenance, and ink had to be purchased or prepared regularly. Even wax tablets, while reusable, required periodic renewal of the wax surface. Lodging costs varied considerably depending on the location and type of accommodation available. Students at cathedral schools in major cities might have to pay high rents for rooms in urban areas where space was at a premium. Those attending monastic schools might live within the monastery itself, but would be expected to contribute to the community through work or financial payments. Food expenses were substantial and ongoing throughout a student's education. While some schools provided meals as part of their fees, the quality and quantity of food was often poor. Students frequently had to supplement their meals with additional purchases from local markets, adding to their overall expenses. During times of harvest failure or economic disruption, food costs could become prohibitive for students from modest backgrounds. Clothing expenses, while often overlooked in modern discussions of medieval education, were significant for students who had to maintain an appropriate appearance befitting their educated status. The rough wool garments worn by students required regular replacement, and those destined for clerical careers needed to acquire the special vestments and accessories required for their future roles. Despite these substantial costs, various forms of financial support did exist to help deserving students from modest backgrounds obtain education. Endowments from bishops, nobles, and wealthy merchants helped support some schools and made it possible for a limited number of poor students to receive education. These endowments were often established as acts of religious charity, with donors believing that supporting education was a virtuous act that would benefit their souls. Some schools established almonries, charitable funds that provided basic support for deserving students from humble backgrounds. These funds might cover tuition costs, provide basic meals, or supply essential books and writing materials. Students supported by almonries were often required to perform additional duties within the school, such as serving at meals, maintaining buildings, or copying texts. Promising students from poor families might also be granted begging rights, formal permission to seek charity from the local community to support their studies. These students would approach wealthy merchants, nobles, or church officials with letters of recommendation from their masters, explaining their circumstances and requesting financial support. This practice was considered honorable rather than shameful, as education was viewed as beneficial to the entire community. Some students supported themselves through their own labor, working as scribes, tutors, or servants while pursuing their studies. This arrangement required exceptional dedication and time management skills, as students had to balance their academic responsibilities with the demands of their employment. Many who attempted this difficult path were forced to abandon their studies when the dual pressures became too overwhelming. The career outcomes for medieval students varied considerably depending on their social background, the level of education they achieved, and the economic and political circumstances of their time. The most successful graduates could look forward to prestigious and influential careers that would provide them with social status, financial security, and the opportunity to shape the intellectual and spiritual development of their society. The church offered the most promising career opportunities for educated men in the medieval period. The most successful graduates might become high-ranking clergy, serving as bishops, abbots, or advisors to kings and princes. These positions provided not only spiritual authority, but also significant temporal power, as church leaders controlled vast estates, commanded armies, and influenced political decisions throughout Europe. Lower-ranking clerical positions were also available to educated men, including serving as parish priests, cathedral canons, or monastic officials. While these positions might not offer the same level of power and prestige as higher offices, they provided security and respect within their communities. Parish priests, in particular, played crucial roles in medieval society, serving not only as spiritual leaders, but also as teachers, mediators in disputes, and keepers of community records. The expanding royal and noble administrations throughout Europe created increasing opportunities for educated laymen to serve in secular capacities. Chancelleries required skilled clerks who could read and write in Latin, maintain official records, and conduct correspondence with other courts and institutions. These positions often led to advancement within the administrative hierarchy, with the most capable clerks eventually becoming trusted advisors to their lords. The legal profession also attracted many university graduates, particularly those who had studied at Bologna or other centers of legal education. The revival of Roman law and the increasing complexity of both secular and ecclesiastical legal systems created demand for educated lawyers who could navigate the intricate procedures of medieval courts. Successful lawyers could achieve considerable wealth and influence, particularly in the growing commercial centers where legal disputes were becoming increasingly common. The medical profession offered another avenue for advancement, though medieval medicine was still largely based on classical texts rather than empirical observation and experimentation. Medical practitioners who had received university training were in demand throughout Europe, though their actual effectiveness in treating diseases was often limited by the inadequate understanding of human anatomy and disease processes that characterized medieval medical knowledge. Teaching itself became an increasingly important career option as the number of schools and universities grew throughout the medieval period. Masters who had achieved recognition for their scholarship might be invited to teach at prestigious institutions where they could influence the next generation of educated men while pursuing their own research and writing. The most famous scholars like Thomas Aquinas or Duns Scotus achieved international reputations that brought them opportunities to teach and write throughout Europe. However, many students never completed their education or achieved the career success they had hoped for when they began their studies. The demands of medieval education were so intense and the discipline so harsh that significant numbers of students abandoned their studies and returned to their families' traditional occupations. The physical and psychological stress of medieval schooling, combined with financial pressures and homesickness, led many promising young men to give up their academic aspirations. These dropouts often retained some benefits from their partial education, using their literacy and numeracy skills in trade, crafts, or local administration. A merchant who could read and write had significant advantages over his illiterate competitors, even if he had never completed a full course of study. Craftsmen who possessed basic mathematical skills could manage their businesses more effectively and participate more fully in the commercial life of their communities. The reputation of educated men in medieval society was complex and often contradictory, reflecting the tension between the high value placed on learning and the practical concerns of everyday life. On one hand, literacy and learning were highly respected and valued, particularly in an age when such skills were rare and precious. Educated men were sought after for their ability to read and write, to conduct correspondence, and to navigate the complex legal and administrative systems that governed medieval society. The term clerk originally referred to any educated man, particularly one who could read and write, and carried connotations of respect and authority. Clerks were essential to the functioning of medieval society, serving in capacities ranging from parish priests to royal administrators. Their skills were valuable, and their services were in demand throughout Europe. On the other hand, excessive learning was sometimes viewed with suspicion by those who valued practical skills and common sense over book learning. The stereotype of the impractical scholar, more concerned with abstract theories than real-world problems, existed even in the medieval period. Some people mocked clerks as being bookish and unworldly, lacking the practical knowledge and street smarts necessary for success in everyday life. This tension between respect for learning and suspicion of excessive intellectualism was reflected in popular literature and folklore of the period. Stories often featured clever peasants outwitting learned but impractical scholars, or portrayed educated men as being easily deceived by those with more practical experience. These tales served to validate the experiences and knowledge of ordinary people while gently mocking the pretensions of the educated elite. The social mobility that education could provide was both celebrated and feared in medieval society. While many people admired those who rose from humble origins through learning and hard work, others worried about the disruption to traditional social hierarchies that such mobility represented. The idea that a peasant's son might become a bishop or royal advisor challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural order of society. Despite these contradictions and tensions, education remained one of the most reliable paths to social advancement available in medieval society. For those who could endure the rigors of medieval schooling and complete their studies successfully, the rewards could be substantial. The knowledge and skills acquired through education opened doors that would otherwise remain firmly closed, providing opportunities for advancement that were simply unavailable to the uneducated masses. As our long journey through the harsh corridors and candlelit chambers of medieval education draws to its close, imagine yourself slowly walking away from that ancient stone schoolroom where we began our exploration. The heavy wooden door creaks softly as it closes behind you, muffling the last echoes of Latin recitations and the scratch of quills on parchment that have filled these walls for centuries. The candles on the wooden desks have burned low, their wax pooling in irregular patterns that will harden and be scraped away tomorrow to make room for new candles and new students. The flames flicker and dance in the drafts that seem to perpetually flow through these ancient buildings, casting wavering shadows on stone walls that have witnessed countless hours of learning, discipline, and quiet desperation. Step quietly through the doorway and into the cloister beyond, where the evening air carries the scent of wood smoke from distant hearths, and the faint sound of Vespers bells beginning to ring across the countryside. The stone floors beneath your feet are worn smooth by generations of students, masters, and visitors who have walked these same paths in pursuit of knowledge, advancement, and understanding. The world outside these walls seems peaceful and still, far removed from the harsh realities of medieval education that we have witnessed together. The constant threat of physical punishment, the grinding memorization of vast texts, the cold and hunger and fear that shaped the daily lives of medieval students seem distant now, like echoes from another world entirely. Yet, as you walk slowly through the quiet evening, you carry with you a new understanding of the dedication and sacrifice that learning required in an age when knowledge was both precious and hard-won. The students we have observed, despite the brutal conditions they endured, were part of a great tradition that preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of the ancient world while laying the foundations for all future learning. Think of those young boys, some barely 7 years old, torn from their families and thrust into a world of Latin grammar and theological disputation. Consider their courage in the face of constant physical punishment, their determination to memorize vast quantities of text despite poor lighting and inadequate food, their persistence in learning to write with primitive tools on expensive materials where every mistake carried consequences. These students, products of a system that seems impossibly harsh to modern sensibilities, went on to become the teachers, administrators, lawyers, and church leaders who would shape European civilization for centuries to come. Their learning, purchased at such a high price in suffering and sacrifice, became the foundation for the universities, libraries, and schools that would eventually make education available to broader segments of society. The manuscript pages they laboriously copied by candlelight preserved the works of classical authors and church fathers that might otherwise have been lost forever. The debates they engaged in, the questions they raised, and the methods of reasoning they developed would evolve into the sophisticated intellectual traditions that continue to influence education and scholarship today. As you continue your quiet walk away from the schoolroom, let yourself appreciate the comfortable warmth of your surroundings, the soft surfaces that support your body, the abundance of light and food and security that modern life provides. The contrast with the harsh conditions endured by medieval students could hardly be greater. Yet their dedication to learning in the face of such difficulties remains an inspiration and a reminder of the true value of education. Feel the gentle evening breeze on your face as you step outside, leaving behind the close atmosphere of the medieval classroom with its smells of tallow candles, damp wool, and ancient parchment. The stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that medieval students would have seen during their brief moments of recreation in monastery gardens and cathedral courtyards. Allow yourself to settle into complete rest now, knowing that you have witnessed something remarkable and important, a world where learning was both treasure and torment, where knowledge was pursued with passionate intensity despite conditions that would seem impossible to endure. The echoes of those ancient voices, reciting their Latin lessons and engaging in their scholarly debates, fade gently into the background as the present moment embraces you with its peace and comfort. Let the steady warmth around you remind you of the privilege of learning in safety and comfort, without fear of physical punishment or the constant struggle against hunger and cold. The journey through medieval education has ended, but the appreciation for learning itself and for those who preserve and transmit knowledge across the generations remains as a gift to carry forward into peaceful sleep. Rest well in the gentle darkness, surrounded by the quiet contentment that comes from understanding how much human civilization owes to those dedicated scholars of the past, who pursued learning despite every obstacle and preserved the light of knowledge through some of the darkest centuries in human history. Their legacy lives on in every school, every library, every moment of learning that takes place in freedom and dignity, a testament to the enduring power of education to transform both individuals and societies. Sleep now, cradled by the knowledge that learning, however difficult the circumstances, has always been one of humanity's most noble pursuits, connecting us across the centuries to all those who have sought truth and understanding in their own time and place. The medieval schoolroom fades into history, but the love of learning it represents continues to illuminate the world, generation after generation, in an unbroken chain of discovery and growth that stretches from the past into the distant future. Let your breathing slow and deepen as you drift toward sleep, carrying with you the quiet wisdom of those ancient halls of learning. The scratching of quills on parchment grows fainter now, replaced by the gentle rhythm of your own heartbeat and the soft whisper of breath moving in and out of your lungs. The stone walls that echoed with Latin recitations for so many centuries fade into the comfortable darkness of rest, their lessons learned and their stories told. Feel yourself sinking deeper into relaxation, as if you were settling into the soft embrace of countless centuries of accumulated knowledge and wisdom. The harsh discipline and physical discomfort that characterized medieval education give way to the gentle peace of understanding, the satisfaction that comes from knowing how learning has evolved and improved over the long course of human history. The candlelight that illuminated those ancient texts grows dimmer and more distant, becoming like the last glowing embers of a fire that has warmed a room through a long winter night. The Latin words that once filled the air with their steady rhythm transform into a gentle lullaby, carrying you deeper into the restful darkness where body and mind can recover and restore themselves. Allow the weight of history to settle around you like a comfortable blanket, knowing that you are part of the same great human story that includes those medieval students who struggled with their lessons by flickering candlelight. Their dedication, their perseverance, and their ultimate success in preserving and transmitting knowledge across the generations has made possible the world of learning that surrounds us today. Rest deeply and peacefully, knowing that the quest for knowledge continues, but now in circumstances of safety, comfort, and freedom that those ancient scholars could never have imagined. Their sacrifices have helped create a world where learning can be pursued with joy rather than fear, with curiosity rather than compulsion, with the support of technology and resources that make education accessible to millions rather than the privileged few. Sleep well, and let the echoes of those medieval voices fade into the gentle silence of the night, carrying their message of dedication to learning into your dreams and beyond. The story of education continues, enriched by understanding of its difficult past and inspired by hopes for its bright future. Rest now in the peace that comes from knowledge well gained and wisdom gently shared.